Professor Halt, again, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
Thanks so much for having me, Ben. I really appreciate it. Great to be with you.
So I want to talk to you about a number of different things, but I have to say, sometimes in between asking my producer to reach out to somebody and having them actually come on and talk to me, they say something that attracts or piques my interest. And yesterday, you tweeted out something that I found very interesting. You wrote, "If by this point you do not understand we are living through an attempted cultural revolution incubated from within the academy, I can't help you. I can just urge you to push back against what you instinctively know is wrong and a lie." I tend to agree with you, but I'd like you to explain what you meant by that.
Sure. So, I've been in the academy as a professor and research for quite some time now. And I've also just been a regular human being who, is living through some of the cultural insanity that we're undergoing here in the States, but also in Canada too, occurring on social media in the, ecosystem there. And, seeing it from within the academy and understanding how it's kind of arisen, to me, it's just jarring in a way to see a lot of the stuff around gender and critical race theory and just more or less a push towards a manipulation of language where everything that you thought was right or normal or correct in your interpretation of how the world works is completely backwards. And, I spend a lot of time on Twitter for my job because I do a lot of work there in terms of connecting with colleagues. And, a lot of what's happening in the academy is being sort of quote unquote fought on Twitter and pushing back on Twitter. If you're an academic who is pushing back against some of the quote unquote woke insanity. And so, having read people like Martin Gurry and connected with people like Mike Schellenberger and others, Chris Rufo, I kind of, I really can't help you anymore if you can't see what's happening in front of your eyes in the culture and the external environment and helping you understand that it's not just a social media phenomenon. It's being talked about there, but it's truly happening. A lot of colleagues that I've had from the Washington, D.C. area where I grew up have told me about what's been happening in the schools there, shared with me various things that have been going on, especially since COVID. So that's more or less what I'm getting at in that tweet. And it seems like every day there's sort of a next level on the ladder in terms of how intense it gets and the pushback that's necessary to, empower people who are otherwise maybe not comfortable speaking out about what they know is just bonkers to say so.
The undercurrent of that tweet, and this is the thing that I think is so interesting about this current moment, is I feel like there's been a great awakening since the dawn of the pandemic to kind of a different framing of our understanding of both the public school K through 12 education system in America, and then also the higher ed approach to things. It's similar. It's very similar to the conversation that happens around media. Basically, the conversation before among right of center or even centrist liberals, in the classic meaning of the term, around what they saw as being a problematic development within academia, was about, turning things into thought crimes, shutting down speech, going after professors who had heterodox views. And they viewed that as being kind of an element of bias within the academy. Now, I think that the attitude is different. Now, I think the attitude is more, oh, wait, this is intentional. This is something that is meant to target people with views that are out of sorts with what this dominant trajectory of, however you want to categorize it, you can call it woke leftism, you can call it, a redefinition of humanity, which I think it is on some level. But basically that, we thought that this was sort of an element of what was going on. It turns out, it seems like, for a lot of Americans, to be the focus of what these entities are about. That, to me, is a pretty disturbing thought.
Yeah, I think what's happened in the academy is you reach a critical threshold of people with a certain view, and it becomes untenable unless you end up in a situation where, rather than being a bias, as you mentioned, it becomes an intentional purging, in a way, of others who have or don't share the sort of mainstream neo-Marxist view of things, of a complete world that is only determined by social factors rather than evolutionary biological foundations that guide human development. And so once you reach that threshold, you have two things happen. One is the people that are kind of directing it are able to direct it more sort of, ham-handedly. And then the others who are left in there either have to get out or, they're cowered into not speaking out because they know that their careers, especially if they're more senior, could be completely tarnished, completely wiped away with one accusation. And so they have to sort of play along. And for me, that's been one interesting part of it, is that I'm more of a junior, academic who, I don't have some of the limitations that other senior academics might have to, not speak out, like a family to support per se right now, or other things that would preclude me from being as vocal and pushing back as I am on Twitter, for example, or even within the academy. And it becomes more of a principled thing for me. If my work is in evolutionary psychopathology and, obviously attending to evolutionary forces and biological forces in human development is important, I'm not going to stand for a world in which, that's sort of considered racist or sexist to consider.
There's a line in Brian De Palma's Mission Impossible movie. I do love anonymity. It's like a warm blanket. and so being a little less famous can sometimes help you in that instance. Look, I want to shift to talking about what I originally wanted to have you on about, which is looking at some of these depression levels among teenagers and some of the conversation around that. But before I do shift to that, I have to ask you, there is this poll, you may have seen it, that commissioned by FIRE, obviously the free speech group, that looked at the concerns among the academic field. And what they found is that an extraordinary number of professors who describe themselves as politically liberal, I would say they're politically leftist, but they're using the old term, are concerned about losing their jobs over what they would name as a misunderstanding, meaning that they will say the wrong thing. Some student will take it up, presumably, take it to the departments in question, and then they will lose their jobs, get fired. To me, I really do have a lot of sympathy for these folks because, but at the same time, didn't they enable this revolution by teaching the kind of things that they have over the past decade or more?
Yeah, I think to some degree you can say that they have. I think there's a difference in classical liberal professor versus the more radical professor that's new from the colleges of education, or who's more radical progressive in the sense of they don't like debate. They're more, I would say, feminine in their characteristics of agreeableness versus not really liking disagreeableness. And if the academy is really going to be what it was intended to be, there needs to be that liberal discourse, which is adversarial and which can be, not always pleasant to engage in. But now you're in a position where even the liberal, classical liberal who liked free speech, who liked viewpoint diversity, even that now is not allowed. And so to say that they enabled it, I think to some degree they have, but I think what's happened is you've just seen a threshold of these new, I guess you could say, they're not classical liberals in the sense of classical liberal. They're more of a new generation, I would say, of liberals who are more radical, more progressive, and not what we would consider someone who's a classical liberal, but just has different views on, fiscal spending or what have you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just think that we're going to see more authoritarianship, more illiberalism, more views that basically say, it's acceptable to shout down speakers, drive people from the academy and the like. And I think there's going to be a backlash to that. I think that there's a natural backlash to it. And people are going to seek out other methods of instruction and of learning in order to get around that.
Yeah, and I think you're seeing that already happen now on Twitter and through Substack and through a lot of professors who are leaving and creating their own podcasts or ways of instruction.
And I think that they're in a certain sense, they're taking the things that they used to say in front of the classroom, exporting them to a larger audience that's more receptive, more interested in what they have to say, and doesn't have the capability, even if they wanted to get them deplatformed. It's a very interesting phenomenon. I'm sure we're going to see it continue to develop. But the original reason that I wanted to talk to you is because I'm very interested in this debate that's playing out. In the past couple of months, it seems to have taken on a new character to it. Among a lot of different politicians, media figures, and academics regarding the levels of depression that we are seeing among American teenagers. Obviously, last month, the CDC released the results of its youth risk behavior survey among American teenagers, and it found, not surprising, I think, to anybody, that teen girls in particular are suffering from just incredible levels of sadness and depression, things that are, on the historical matrix, very high. What actually prompted my interaction with you was me making a joke, which I don't think actually people took as a joke, about the idea that depression in the 1990s led to some really great music. and I was trying to just sort of find the silver lining here. But this is actually of deep concern, I think, for a lot of people, American parents, obviously people who care about the element of social media in terms of driving this, which is what we hear a lot about from the politicians. I'm curious as to your perspective on this. What are the sources of this phenomenon? How serious is it? How much should it be an item of concern among parents, voters, politicians, and policymakers?
Well, I think it's a big concern, particularly for adolescent females in particular. I think there's a number of factors. I do share John Haidt's opinion that social media has a lot to do with this. Not exclusively, as any question about human development is. It's not just exclusively one factor, but social media, I think, is a big part of it, which is not just that people are getting into it and away from connecting with others in the real world, but it is driving everyone to a world that is disconnected from the external environment. I think the other part of it, obviously the pandemic played a role in this too. But the third part of it, I think, is to some degree, there is a sort of a breakdown in the culture of what I would call interdicts or rules, in a post-religious world where anybody can be free to pick an identity, or to think that that's the way the world works becomes problematic when you have a lack of structure, whether that's a lack of structure from no religion or just a breakdown in the parental unit, the family. But you can also have that coming from people just being too distracted from the chaos of politics, from the chaos of school disruptions, from the pandemic. But we know from research just more generally that even despite all of that, men and women differ in their rates of depression, anxiety, neuroticism. Men tend to be more aggressive. These are basic facts of biology. But for adolescent females, once you get into these spaces and you disconnect from the external environment and typical social interactions at school, at athletics, it can become very toxic in that environment. And I think, especially with females in a post-religious landscape with no structure, you get into these algorithmic media platforms which can, lead to self-comparison, about, for whatever reason, for body image, for just who you are. And TikTok is one that I've focused in on with some colleagues that's been more.
Yes. I've read some of your work on this. It certainly seems to have, it definitely, has taken over the kind of mind virus level that social media can have.
Yeah, TikTok and Instagram, and to a certain degree, even Twitter. But I think for adolescent females, when you get into those spaces that focus in on comparison of body image or comparison of social relationships, it can be very damaging to the self-concept. And then you get into these spaces where the actual identification with a disorder becomes the person's sort of self-concept. Because in a post-religious world, or a world where otherwise they're not building their self-identity through means that would normally occur through sports or through school or through normal human social relations, what becomes their identity is this new victim mindset. Others have spoken about this quite a bit as well. And it's sort of this victim-based world that becomes sort of the cachet to identify oneself as. And so that becomes reinforced and reinstantiated, and so they live in that world where they expect to behave in that way, and that can lead to, obviously, depression, anxiety, and other forms of mental illness that they're ticking off in these surveys, but more generally, an existence that is sort of existentially void of any hope. And I think that's really something that's concerning. And if you think about it, even when you go outside or you interact in your daily course of affairs, everybody is on their phone at some point. And so it's pulling away at population scale from normal human relationships. And, if you're an adult with some level of self-restraint, you can kind of put the phone down, engage with your family, engage with your friends, sports, what have you. That's not as easy for someone else whose world is completely immersed in that environment. And so
can I ask you a personal question?
Yeah.
Do you have that setting on your phone where it alerts you at the end of the week about your usage, like your average hours or anything like that?
I don't have that. However, I'm well aware that I spend a good deal of time on social media, but one of the escapes for me is physical activity where I have to be engaged in either playing hockey or some sort of aggressive physical activity where you simply physically can't have the phone in your hand.
That's a wonderful way to approach it. I like to go on walks where I leave my phone at home. So I just don't have the capacity to interact with it. There's a response piece from Matthew Iglesias, who's been a guest on this podcast before, on his Substack, Slow Boring, which you can find at slowboring.com. And the headline for his piece is, "Why Are Young Liberals So Depressed?" He writes in part, a 2021 paper by Catherine Gimbrone, Lisa Bates, Seth Prins, and Catherine Keyes. It's titled, "The Politics of Depression, Diverging Trends and Internalizing Symptoms Among U.S. Adolescents." The CDC survey doesn't ask teens about their political beliefs, but Gimbrone, et cetera, or et al., find not only divergence by gender, but divergence by political ideology. Breaking things down by gender and ideology, they find that liberal girls have the highest increase in depressive effect, and conservative boys have the least. Liberal boys, however, are more depressed than conservative girls, suggesting an important independent role for political ideology. I'm not going to ask you to evaluate a paper, which I don't even know if you've read or not, but I found that to be an interesting suggestion. The idea that liberalism within this sort of younger cohort, they were looking at high schoolers, so I believe it was 12th graders, 11th to 12th graders that they were looking at. I found that to be an interesting insight into this because, you know, I mean, we can have all the kind of cliched talk about fear-mongering on the left about climate change or the end of the world or something like that. But there does seem, in a kind of academic sense, to be a consequence to some of the concerns that have been raised on that side of things. It's interesting to me that the people who are most opposed to the prevalence of social media in American life, people like Josh Hawley, et cetera, in the Senate, are on the right, even as it seems like the victims of that, at least on the assessment of this paper and some other research as well, tend to be on the left.
Yeah, and it's funny you bring that post by Iglesias up. I actually had I replied to him on Twitter, and I actually had discussed that same paper in a prior Substack essay where I break down the current trend of some of this.
I love when I run into something that someone has already written about.
Yeah, and so on my Substack, I have a piece where I responded on Twitter the other day when I saw that post by Maddie that I'd already discussed this in some great length, but yes, absolutely. In the paper that he cited, I had actually posted in the Substack essay that I wrote, so I'll direct you to my Substack to see that.
We'll link that in the show notes. Great.
Yeah, absolutely. The left is a movement that is about fear, and it's about fear of existence, really, that drives a lot of their policy and their call to action. And if you think back to the Democratic National Convention prior to the 2020 election, you know, who was the guest when we were in the pandemic and it was all remote? If you remember, it was
surreal.
Right. And so that was sort of the glamorization of the victim mental illness as identity sort of framework. And so part of it is that they valorize sort of that victim mentality, and it's driven by, you know, it's contextualized by fear of environment catastrophe, or it's fear of being oppressed in some way, or basically marginalized. And the problem with that is it takes away the agency of the person to address their situation. So they wallow in that self-pity rather than recognizing that, hey, I have a problem or an issue that I can change, or at the very least that I probably shouldn't amplify and wallow in. And so I think part of it comes down to the worldview that has this sort of oppressor mentality, and they have to be, or they have to cast themselves as a victim in some way, to appeal to the empathy of voters, to appeal to the ears of voters, potential voters about, for example, climate catastrophe, and so I talk a little bit about that in my Substack essay where I talk about this paper, and social media amplifies that. And so you have this sort of situation in which that whole movement is sort of exaggerated through social media and sort of absurd displays. Think about all the climate activists and their grandiose displays of gluing themselves to floors or destroying paintings. It's enhanced by the sharing of it on social media. And the same can be said, too, for these presentations of illness. I wrote a piece on my Substack about TikTok. It's all this sort of visual element to it. And so I think a lot of it has to do with the worldview of progressive, more so radical progressive orthodoxy, which is really what defines the left right now. And so being someone who studies psychopathology in the academy, it has struck me that this is the case. And you see this too with the gender stuff as well. So I did happen to see that, and I think if you read the essay that I wrote, it might shed some additional light on why this is tending to be a adolescent female sort of liberal element to it.
So you anticipated my last question, which is that, we see weird responses to these different developments, including some within Canada, some within America, of various people trying to find ways to push back against this agenda of authoritarian wokeness, authoritarian leftism. But I think that a lot of Americans, myself included, are very concerned about this because we're anticipating. I mean, I have a 2.5-year-old girl and I have a 5-week-old girl, and we were, starting our college funds for them this past week. And I was joking to my wife. I was just like, "Are we sure we even want to do that?" It's like, do we want them to assume that they should go to college? And at a certain point, it's like, look, there are people who travel from all around the world to come to American institutions of higher education. It's one of the things that draws people here. How do we save this? How do we not just, it's one thing as a conservative or as a, kind of an online personality to say, let's just tax the hell out of Harvard and light the whole thing on fire, but at the same time, I think that, we would actually rather restore these institutions to being ones where people could go and learn, could profit from that experience, could have knowledge that could be of great benefit to the American people and to the world. Is higher ed something that can be saved, or is it lost to us?
I've really asked myself that question many times now, and I think more and more I've become of the mentality that it might be lost. However, one of the things that's recently given me some hope is the work that Chris Rufo and Ron DeSantis have been pushing forward, getting rid of the DEI bureaucracies and correcting some of the problems that have let this sort of happen in the first place. And so I think there has to be both a forward thinking of building new institutions with the thinking that they're gone, but also working at the same time doing what Ron and others like Chris who've helped him push forward this new sort of way of pushing back against the DEI bureaucracy. And I think once there is some empowerment going on and there's sort of a revolt from within, it may be potential that the silent majority within the academies could push back and gain some momentum that way. But I think it has to be a two-pronged approach. It's hard to say what will the end be, but at the very least, the continued pushback has to occur. Otherwise, it's going to be a bad deal for civilizational functioning once this stuff breaks down completely. So I think if you had to pin me down, I think it would probably be a good idea to think about new institutions first, but at the same time, have these ground level movements that are pushing back, because there are people in these institutions that know this stuff is bonkers. And so empowering them to speak out, I think, could be very helpful in the long game too.
A bad deal civilizationally. I like that frame.
I try to think of a way to sort of frame that. But when you think about some of the cities that are spiraling out of control with crime and, things like restorative justice, that's a product of what's happened in the academy. So they're not
people. Well, no, you're bringing up a really good point, which is to say, it's a weird thing to think about, but it is true. The fact that your pistachios are behind a locked plastic window when you go and buy them in New York is kind of a direct line from the Academy in its origination. People don't necessarily draw that connection, but it's actually quite true.
That right, and I think the dysfunction in politics as well, but also obviously the hot button issue right now with the gender stuff, that is directly, clearly a function of what's happened in the Academy, and it's dangerous. I mean, it's there's going to be a price that a lot of human adolescents are going to have to pay, and it's important to correct this before it gets even worse out of control.
Mm-hmm. Professor Haltigan, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
Thank you, Ben. I really enjoyed it.
Great. Appreciate it. And thank you. And this should go up on Monday.
Thanks so much, Ben. Just let me know, and let me know if you have any questions on email. I'll be happy to share. I do
absolutely
encourage you to check out the Substack piece I wrote that I responded.
No, I will make sure that that's linked. Yes. Thank you very much. All right. Take care, sir.